So this is the last slide that we covered last time, and we were talking about the conducting system of the heart, which includes SA node, the pacemaker of the heart. Then we have the AV node, the internodal pathways that helps to send the action potentials that are generated by the SA node into the atria so that the atria can contract after they receive these action potentials. And then between the AV node and the bundle branches, we have the atrioventricular bundle at the very top of the interventricular septum, which is this. So when action potentials move from the SA node into the AV node, it goes again into the atria so that the atria can contract. And here, once this action potential reaches the AV node, you will have a delay. That delay of the action potentials is to help for the atria to receive blood. And then after they have a particular amount of blood, then you can trigger the release of these action potentials so that they can go from the AV bundle into the right or the left bundle branches inside the interventricular septum, reaching the apex, and then from the apex, these action potentials are distributed up into the base of the ventricles by the Purkinje fibers, which transfer this action potential much faster than these bundle branches. And then at any given point, these nerves, this system of wires that I told you about before, this conducting system can be blocked. And the further that you have the block, the less beating of the heart that you will have. Typically, SA node makes our heart to beat around 100 beats per minute, which is too high. But we have the vagus nerve that decreases that heart rate. And then if this SA node was damaged for whatever reason, now the second pacemaker of the heart that it will take over the function of the heart to make it beat will be the AV node. And that will make the heart to beat like around 40 to 50 beats per minute, which is not enough to send blood into the brain. And then the person will be feeling dizzy, will faint, and then the person needs to have a replacement. He has to have a new pacemaker to maintain the typical heart rate of an adult, which is 80 beats per minute. So that's the conducting system. For the contractile cells, which is the myocardium, the myocytes, the muscle cells. So that makes 99% of the muscle tissue. The other 1% is the conducting system, and also the skeleton of the heart. So contractile cells, they have also their own action potential. So conducting system cells, they have their spontaneous action potential that takes slow depolarization and then repolarization and continues the circle. So the waves that you see are different from the ones of the heart muscle cells and also from the skeletal muscle cells. In the heart muscle cells, it's just rapid depolarization and rapid repolarization, just like this, like if you were pigs. In the case of cardiac muscle cells, the action potential, it's a little bit different, and this action potential will have the first phase, which is rapid depolarization, in which you have opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium rushes in, it's a positive ion, so the cells become less negative, and then the voltage can be seen as going up in the trace from an oscilloscope. And that rapid depolarization is going to activate calcium ion channels. Slowly, but it's going to activate them. And then you will have once you reach the peak of depolarization, an initial repolarization that is going to be short and in length and in time. And that is caused by the closure of the sodium channels and an opening of potassium channels that will allow the escape of the potassium, which is positively charged, and suddenly you will have a plateau or a horizontal trace that represents the opening of the voltage-gated calcium channels, not only within the plasma membrane of the cardiomyocytes, but also within the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a storage for calcium. And that will help for the depolarization to stay a little bit longer in time, and that will make the heart cells to contract more powerfully. So that's the purpose of this plateau phase. And it is given by the opening of these calcium channels. So calcium then is necessary for this plateau phase, and you will have intracellular calcium release and extracellular calcium coming in. And in cardiac muscle cells, that's what it makes the cardiac muscle cells to contract much stronger than any other type of cells. So here is what happens in the plasma membrane during rapid depolarization. Calcium channels are closed, potassium channels are closed, but you have these voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium comes in from the extracellular fluid into the cytosol, the inside of the cells, the cytoplasm of the cardiomyocytes. And then see how in this graph your voltage goes from minus 85 to reach plus 20. That's the rapid depolarization. So you have a lot of sodium coming in. And then your sodium channel will close. You open the gate of these voltage-gated potassium channels. These potassium channels allows the exit of the potassium, and then you have a drop in the voltage, which is called the initial repolarization phase. And it's small, it's not complete. After that, you will have the plateau phase, and then you will have repolarization phase. In repolarization phase, both sodium and calcium channels return to their resting states, closed, and then most of the potassium channels open, which allows more potassium to exit, and that will lead to the resting membrane potential going back to minus 85. It's like when you go to a concert in a big city with a big stadium. At the beginning of the concert, maybe they don't open all doors for people to come in before the concert, but they open gradually. As they see more people, they open more doors and more people comes in. And then if the concert is over and they want to control where the people is exiting, well, they can close several doors and only people go through certain areas of the stadium. And then as less people is found inside, what they do is definitely they just have one exit and then people have to exit through there. So similarly, that's what happens with action potentials. So here we have the visualization of this plateau phase. So your sodium channels are closed. You still have open your potassium channel, so you have basically exiting of potassium, but that is counteracted by the entry of calcium from the extracellular fluid. So that maintains or sustains this depolarization. So from plus 20 goes slowly up to 0. And that happens basically within 300, from 0 to 250 milliseconds. That's how you sustain that depolarization, plus the calcium that is coming in from the storage, from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then after you reach then the ending of this plateau at 250 milliseconds, this is the time in seconds, milliseconds, and this is the voltage. So basically, once this ends at 250 milliseconds, you open your potassium channels, like these ones nearby, and then more potassium exits, then you go to resting, minus 85. And during this time, you have a refractory period in which if you have a secondary stimulus, you don't have contraction of your muscle cells. That will allow the ventricles and the atria to get filled with blood. So this is a comparison between skeletal muscle fiber action potentials and cardiac muscle action potentials. So see here how rapid is this action potential in these skeletal muscles. So depolarization, rapid repolarization in about 5 milliseconds. So because of this, you can have more stimuli allowing this contraction in the muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells to happen, and then you can reach something that's called tetany, sustained contraction. Now in here, in this cardiac muscle, you have this effective refractory period, which is the same as this absolute refractory period in the skeletal muscle, but it is longer, between 0 to 200 milliseconds or 250. You can add elicit a secondary action potential. So then this is the cardiac muscle action potential, which is different from the pacemaker action potential as well. I guess they're supposed to have put them all together so you can see them side by side, the three of them. So then because the action potential in a skeletal muscle is shorter in time, that means that the heart rate will be 15 times faster than it should be, a resting heart rate. And then the plateau phase lengthens the action potential by 200, 300 milliseconds. So contraction of the cardiac muscle is the same as the skeletal muscle. You have sliding of actin over myosin, and then breaking that cross bridge. Remember that actin is bound by the heads of myosin, and then is pulled toward the center of the sarcomere. So you shorten the length. And then if you have additional calcium ions coming from the extracellular fluid, that makes the the contraction of the cardiac muscle to be stronger. And this actually, extracellular fluid that is reaching calcium, can help for calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, because we have channels that can detect the presence of calcium, and this event is called calcium ion-induced calcium ion release. All this electrical activity can be recorded in an electrocardiogram. And the electrocardiogram has waves that has specific names and represents a specific electrical activity and even mechanical activity of the heart. So everything starts with the P wave. P wave represents the polarization of the atria. So SA node generates the action potentials. Those action potentials are spreading to the atria by the internodal pathways of the conducting system. The cardiac muscle cells of the atria contract during atrial depolarization. And then you have a complex that is known as QRS. It is three waves that are very close together. The first wave is negative, the second one is positive, the third one is negative. So this is QRS. And this QRS represents when the ventricles, the muscles in the ventricle are depolarizing. And it is more positive than the P because in the ventricles you have more muscle cells than the atria. So you can see it as a taller wave. And then the T wave represents the repolarization of the ventricles when the ventricle becomes negative again. And that basically ends all the waves of this EKG in, of course, running the EKG only for this length. But we have intervals in between these waves that represent something as well. Like for instance, we have the RR interval, which is the distance between two R waves and represents a heartbeat. The time in which a heartbeat occurs. It can help to determine the heart rate when the heart rate is regular. And we have the PR interval, that is, it is measured from the beginning of the P to the beginning of the Q. I will call it more properly PQ interval than PR, but they leave it like that. And that represents the time that it takes for the atria to depolarize up to the spread of this depolarization to the ventricles, to the beginning when the ventricles are going to depolarize. More properly speaking, is the time that it takes for the action potentials from travel from the SA node to the AB node. When this interval it is elongated, that means that there is a block at this pathway between the SA node and the AB node. The QT interval, it starts at the Q and basically ends at the beginning of the T. That's when your ventricular cells are undergoing action potential. So it's basically the QRS complex. And then we have the ST segment, which basically represents the plateau phase of the ventricles. There is no net activity, electrical activity. So it's like a flat line. And that basically gives us information about what is going on in the heart. And then sometimes we can have differences in the length of these waves, and that can be what we call a dysrhythmia, that can include basically shortening of the time where the heartbeats occur, or maybe lengthening, and not in a specific space of time in between. So we will see some examples of these arrhythmias. So some disturbances in the heart rate include dysrhythmia. So we can have what is called bradycardia, in which your heartbeat will be less than 60 beats per minute, or we can have tachycardia, in which your heartbeat will be greater than 100 beats per minute. And here we have something that is called sinus tachycardia. So in sinus tachycardia, we always see the presence of P waves. Now, these grids that you see here are found in the EKG. We will go a little bit more in detail in the lab because you will take an EKG in the lab when we do the exercises for cardiac physiology. But basically we have 300 of these running per minute. How many seconds do we have per minute? These large squares, they run 300 per minute. So how many seconds we have per minute? 60. Divide 300 by 60. Five. So 5 of these runs per second. So, if you divide, let's say that the average heart rate of a person is 75, divide 300 by 75. How many of these squares do you suppose to see in between these peaks? So this is the P wave, guys. I'm sorry, I didn't have a normal EKG there to show you, but this is the P wave, this is the Q, this is the R, this is the S, and this is the T. So then the RR interval, which is the distance between two of these R's, can be measured in how many large squares you have in between. So did you make the division of 300 by 75? 4. So if someone will have a normal heart rate, which is normal for us, of 75 beats per minute, you're supposed to see basically 4 large squares in between the two R's. But when you see less than that, that means that you have a higher heart rate. So, for instance, in this case, and typically you start for measuring for much easier calculation, you start with the edge that shows, or with the line that shows specifically aligning with one of the R's, and then you count from there. Now, these large squares are subdivided into small squares. So we said that 5 runs per second. So if you divide 1 second by 5 of these, each of these large squares represents 0.2 of a second. So it's 1/5 of a second, one of each of these. And then we have actually 5 small lines, vertical lines, in between these large squares. And each of these represents 0.04 of a second. So since we don't have these small lines in there, let's pretend that here you have reached like the second small line. So then when you count from the distance in squares between this first R and this second R, you have, let's say, 2 large squares, and then in this case will be 0.4. Why? Because, 0.08, because you have 2 small lines in there. So let me show you the division there in that, and then we also have 5 horizontal in there. But like if this was a large square, you will see it in the EKG, in the classroom, in the lab. So you have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. And then you have also some of bearing here. So this one represents millivolts in this axis, and then time in seconds in this axis. So we said that one of these, because we have 5 per second, this represents 0.20 seconds or 0.2 seconds. And each of these small ones represents 0.404 seconds. So if you multiply 0.04 times 5, that's supposed to give you 0.20 seconds. So I said that that R that you see there, here, is landing in here. So 0.04 times 2, it's supposed to be 0.08. So then you have two large squares there. So if each of these is 0.20 second per square equals 1 square, large square, I'm supposed to put here 1 large square. And we said that you have 2 large squares, so you multiply these times 2 because you have 2 large squares. So this one makes it 0.40 seconds. But since you have 2 small squares, so this is 2 large squares. Because you have 2 small squares, you add 0.08 seconds. So this is 2 large squares. Plus your 2 small squares. So that make it 0.48 seconds. So every 0.48 seconds, you're having heartbeat. That is too fast. So what you need to do then to calculate the heart rate really easily when you have regular heart rhythm, you have to divide 300 by 2.4. So what will be the heart rate in that case? 300 divided by 2.4. Beats per minute, you abbreviate it as BPM. Is that tachycardia? 125 beats per minute? Yes. It is tachycardia. Let's say now that we have a thin person, an athlete, and he has 5 large squares between 2 R waves. What will be the heartbeat? Someone has 5 large squares between the 2 R waves. What do you need to do first? Divide. What number you're going to divide? You're going to calculate an EKG, the actual heart rate. So someone has a distance between these two of 5 large squares.
Per 1 heartbeat. Right?
Yes.
They'd have one heartbeat a second. Well, according to that graph at least.
So if you have 5 large squares in between 2 R waves, what do you need to do? Look what I did there. So what is 300?
Say MV.
Millivolts? No, millivolts runs in this direction. What is 300? The number of what that runs in 1 minute, right? So the number of what? The number of squares that runs per minute in an EKG. The number of large squares. 300 large squares runs per minute. You will see the paper that it comes out from this EKG machine, how it's basically been coming out from the printer. If you let it run for 1 minute, it's going to be a long EKG. Are you going to be counting each R wave to count how many beats per minute? It's going to be a lot. So much easier, divide 300 by the number of large squares that you have between the R waves. Now, someone has 5 large squares in between the 2 R waves. So what do you need to do? 300 divided by 5. How many beats per minute will the person have? 60. That's still within the normal range. It's not bradycardia. So after 5, the person will have slower heart rate. But let's say that someone has 5 large squares and 2 to 3 small squares. That drops, like, let's say, up to 57. If someone has six large squares, what is going to be the beats per minute of that person in between the 2 R's? If someone has 6 large squares between the 2 R's, 50. Do you think that person is going to be very happy and then conscious? No, the person is going to be feeling dizzy and it's going to faint. The greater the distance that you see between these, greater than 5, the more likely that the heartbeats per minute are dropping. The shorter the distance is going to be, the higher the heart rate.
So is this where you'd also see arrhythmia?
Arrhythmia, it is basically when you don't have regularity between the space. Binge eating is not basically having your 3 meals a space in time, right? You grab a period of time where you're just eating and eating and eating continuously, you don't stop. So that's basically considered like kind of an arrhythmia, when you don't have specific intervals of time. So we have another type of dysrhythmia, heart block. How do I know? Because this interval, basically it is longer and I don't have a QRS. So I have P wave, but I don't have a QRS. The QRS has skipped. Some diseases, like in a block, you have a longer PR or extra P waves. The atrial response, but not the ventricles. The AV bundle is not sending the action potentials into the left and right bundle branches and into the Purkinje fiber, so the ventricles, they don't contract. Eventually, they pick it up. That's why you see the QRS. And then atrial fibrillation, AFib. Basically, in here, this is not a generally life-threatening situation like ventricular fibrillation or VFib, but because this is not necessary to fill the ventricles with blood, but it looks like an irregular rhythm. In this case, this is an arrhythmia. So see how you have here shortening between the 2R and here is longer. And then this is a little bit longer than this, but not as long as this. So this is basically what is called irregular. It's like those people who come late, but you don't know if it's going to be coming 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late, 30 minutes late. And there are people who come late, but come late within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you always know. So that's regularly irregular, because you know that within 5 to 10 minutes this person is going to come. But sometimes people, it's like Armageddon. Everyone knows that it's coming, but only knows, God knows when. So ventricular fibrillation, you don't see the presence of QRS. Why? Because that's when the ventricles contract. So you don't see QRS. And you don't see the peace as well, because basically the ventricles are kind of trying to regularize the rhythm, but they can't. And in this case, this is life-threatening, because the ventricles are the ones that sends the blood into the body. So this is dangerous. And this, of course, has to be treated appropriately. Well, same as the other one. So any questions about these arrhythmias? Now, so for mechanical physiology, so a heartbeat, it's basically coming from these action potentials that these conducting system cells send into the cardiomyocytes. And then your cardiomyocytes contract, and they will basically send this mechanical force from the different areas of the muscle of the heart, starting in the ventricles, for instance, from apex to base, to help to push the blood from the bottom of the ventricles to the top, where is the opening of these arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, so that you can propel the blood across these different branches of these blood vessels. Now, the cardiac cycle represents the division of this mechanical activity, the contraction of the heart and the relaxation of the heart. So contraction of the heart is known as systole, relaxation of the heart is diastole. During diastole, the chambers fill with blood. During systole, the chambers empty the blood. And one is supposed to precede the other. So there is a relationship between pressure changes, blood flow, and valve function. So when your left ventricle contracts, that increases the pressure inside the ventricle. And that basically closes the atrioventricular valve, in this case the mitral, and opens the aorta. Why? Because during contraction of the ventricle, the atria has less pressure than the ventricles, and then the aorta has as well less pressure than the ventricles. And by gravity, after contraction of the ventricles, the blood goes into this semilunar, this is the aortic valve, and then closes the opening of the aorta, allowing this ventricle to now, once the pressure drops as the blood is ejected, the filling back of this ventricle. So this contraction of the ventricle is called the ventricular systole, but it also undergoes ventricular diastole. So in here we have ventricular systole that closes the mitral valve and opens the aorta. And a specific volume of blood exits or is ejected from this ventricle into the aorta. Now, after this happens, then you see how here the blood that is in the aorta, now it is closing the semilunar valve, the aortic valve, and then how the mitral opens, due to the, basically the atria having now blood to pump into this ventricle, and then that will open because the pressure in the atria is going to be greater than the ventricles. After the ventricle is emptying its blood as majorly as it can, it's never empty completely. It will leave some blood. But then that drops the pressure, and then because you have more pressure in the atria than the ventricles, and because of the aid of gravity, then the blood is going to flow now during diastole of the ventricles. Now is going to lead for the filling of blood of the ventricles. Let me give you an example. I guess you have to stand back. The lassie has these markers in her hand. That's the blood. She's the atria. I'm the ventricle. We have here in between the mitral valve. Is the left side. Left atrium, left ventricle. I'm in systole. I am ejecting the blood. Try to give me the markers. Can I get them? No. Why? Because I have a lot of pressure here. And now what I need to do to receive these markers? What do I need to do with this to receive the markers? Tell me. Otherwise I won't do it. I will keep on systole. Open it up, release the pressure. Now I can receive them. And now you close them. And now I'm going to inject, I'm going to push to the aorta, and then the blood comes back from the pulmonary veins into the atria. If the atria remains in systole, it will not receive the blood from the pulmonary veins. So what does she needs to do? Release the pressure, become in diastole, so you can receive it. Guys, I saw once in a video that someone who's generous, it opens its hands to give to others. Someone who's basically tight, or who's not generous, is going to have their palms closed. So if you're generous, you're also going to receive.
What do the numbers represent? So I've heard the term systolic and diastolic thrown around. You said the same terms.
So we have systolic and diastolic pressure. That's the pressure in millimeters of mercury. That's the unit to measure pressure that we have during contraction of the heart and relaxation of the heart. Systolic is the pressure that is the highest, 120/80. So 120 represents the blood pressure when the heart is contracting, 80 when the heart is relaxing. And that difference of pressure, that's what keeps the blood from flowing. It's like, for instance, if we were exchanging the blood, right? Imagine the atria and the ventricles like this at the same time. No one is going to receive anything. So they don't occur simultaneously. So you have systole, diastole, systole, diastole, systole, diastole, contraction, relaxation. So that allows the flow of blood from atria into ventricles, and from ventricles into arteries, and then from veins into the atria. So the heart sounds are produced not by opening the valves of the heart. but by closing the valves of the heart. So during systole, ventricular systole, you close the atrioventricular valves, and during ventricular diastole, you close the semilunar. So you have two sounds, S1 and S2, which are known as lub dub. So the S1, sound 1, lub, is heard when the AV valves close, while the S2, or dub, is heard when the semilunar valves close. Now the AV valves are larger than the semilunar. So this one, the closure of the AV valves, mitral and tricuspid, will give you a louder sound than the closure of the semilunars, the aortic and the pulmonary valve. And then S1 is typically longer as well, not only louder but longer, and S2 is lower in frequency. And these heart sounds can be heard in specific areas in a better way. So for instance, aortic valve can be heard better in the second intercostal space, right parasternal border, across in the same second intercostal space, but in the left side, you have the sound of the pulmonary valve, and look at the location. It's just because as basically the blood is flowing, it has resonance. So it increases the heart sounds, specifically in these areas for aortic and pulmonary. Now for the mitral, is fifth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and then tricuspid, it is in the left parasternal border, fifth intercostal space. So these two are the AV valves, the ones that produces S1, and these two are the ones that produces the second sound, the semilunar. So if I open this door, sorry for those of you who are there. So if I open that door there, I'm not producing any sound. So this door is open. Now, so the valve is open, blood is flowing from atria to ventricles, no sound. Then the ventricles contract and squeeze the blood out of the ventricles, and then that's what it produces the sound, the closure of the valve. And you hear that sound extra? Well, that's vibration of the ventricular muscle. That's what also what produces the heart sounds. If that door was bigger, will basically give a louder sound, and that represents the AV valves, and this one will represent basically the semilunar. And I do that every semester, basically to show you how a passive act of opening a door doesn't produce a sound, but slamming it is. So you can have extra sounds like murmurs, in which you have basically turbulent blood inside the heart, or you can have a defective valve, or the choroidal tendineae will be defective, or holes in the atrial septum, interventricular septum, and that produces a heart sound. Sometimes some people, especially children, can have a third or even a fourth sound, and that's normal for them. But if it's not, it can be sometimes that the ventricular walls are so stiff because of long-term hypertension, and then you can have an extra sound. So again, cardiac cycle is contraction or systole, and relaxation or diastole. And then during this period of time, you have ventricular filling, And at the end of diastole of the ventricle, you have 120 milliliters of blood. And then once you reach 120 milliliters, your ventricle sustains a little bit the contraction, but it doesn't eject the blood. So that is known as isovolumetric contraction phase. So it's like trying to see how much force it needs to apply to push the blood out of the ventricles. So this is the ventricular filling phase. The left atrium contracts, while this one is in diastole. It brings the blood into the left ventricle, and then the ventricle will end up with 120 milliliters at EDV, end of the diastolic volume. And then it starts to contract during isovolumetric contraction, and that will push the blood through this aortic valve in the next phase, which is the ejection phase. And at the end of the systole, when the heart contracts, leave about 50 milliliters of blood. Here it comes again. This is 120 milliliters of blood. I contract and I keep 50. So how much do I inject it? If I had 120 and I keep 50? 7. That's what is called, when you divide 70 over 120, that's what you call ejection fraction, which is like around 58%. If you divide 120 over 70, that's 0.58. Now, specifically that 70, more properly is known as a stroke volume. How much blood do you eject per heartbeat? And if you just multiply that times the number of heartbeats that you have per minute, you end up with what is called cardiac output, which is typically like 5 liters per minute. Our heart delivers 5 liters per minute. And then your ventricle relaxes, and then it keeps these 50 milliliters that is known as isovolumetric relaxation phase, which is basically represented in here. And this is the ventricular ejection phase, in which you, out of the 120 milliliters, you eject in your stroke volume 70, you keep 50, and then the muscle relaxes. So the right ventricle has to overcome less pressure than the left ventricle, because the pulmonary trunk has a maximum pressure of 28 millimeters of mercury, while the left ventricle has to overcome around 118 millimeters of mercury. That's why you have a minimum of 120. But that varies. I mean, when you are young, you have less stiff arteries, so then your normal blood pressure is lower. But as you age and your arteries become harder, then your heart has to pump harder, and that's when your blood pressure goes high to compensate. So this can be seen, the difference between the right ventricle and the right ventricle in this graph. In the y-axis, you have pressure in millimeters of mercury. And in this x-axis, it tells you in which ventricular phase you are. In this case, the left part is when your ventricles are getting filled in diastole, and this is in systole. So your pressure in your left ventricle, see, it's about 28 in the pulmonary trunk, and in the left ventricle is 0 during diastole. But during systole, your ventricular pressure, it's a little bit higher, like 30, and this one is 28. So that allows the flow of blood. And then in the left ventricle, during diastole, your pressure can range between 5 to 10, and your aorta maintains a blood pressure of 90, dropping a little bit. And then during isovolumetric contraction, because your ventricles are getting filled with blood, and then they contract a little bit to increase the pressure, they can get a higher pressure of up to, let's say, 100 millimeters of mercury or 120 depending. And then your aorta also increases the pressure, but this is because the aorta is getting filled with blood. No matter what, the increased pressure from the left ventricle, it is greater than the aorta, and that keeps the blood going out from the aorta until you basically had all these 70 milliliters of blood ejected, and then your pressure inside your ventricle drop during diastole. So pressure goes up during systole, drops during diastole. And then the cardiac cycle diagram or Wigger's diagram shows you the extrapolation of the heart sounds with the electrocardiogram and the pressure even not only in the ventricles but also in the jugular vein. So here we have the traces of the EKG, like for instance, depolarization of your ventricles here, contraction of ventricles here, and then relaxation of your ventricles here. And that represents here the heart sounds S1 and S2. So basically, when your ventricles are contracting and closes the AV valves, when your ventricles are relaxing and you have closure of your your semilunar at the end of systole, and the increase of pressure and drop of pressure in your ventricles. And then your volume changes. So when you have lower pressure in your ventricles and atria, you have greater volume than when you have increased pressure. Your pressure is increased, that helps to eject the blood, and then you continue the cycle again. So cardiac output and regulation, so your heart rate can average between 60 to 80 beats per minute. Your S-stroke volume or SR is the amount of blood pumped in one heartbeat. Cardiac output, the amount of blood pumped per minute. This is how you determine your cardiac output. So this is N diastolic volume, ADV 120 minus 50, and systolic volume equals 70 milliliters. That's a stroke volume. You calculate your stroke volume, and then your cardiac output is multiplying your heart rate times the stroke volume. So if someone has 72 beats per minute and is pumping 70 milliliters of blood per beat, your stroke volume, that gives you a total 70 times 72, 5,040 milliliters, which is basically 5 liters of blood per minute. When someone has increased heart rate, it would pump more blood, of course, but this one can drop when someone has a hemorrhage, and a compensation is to increase the heart rate so that you can pump more blood. Ejection fraction can vary between 50 to 65%. That's how much you spend or how much blood you eject per minute. And what factors can influence the stroke volume? Preload, how much return of blood you have. If someone is dehydrated, if someone has a hemorrhage, the preload decreases. So that decreases your stroke volume. If your heart contracts more times, well, you have less time for having diastole. That leads to less filling of your ventricles. And your afterload will be the force against that the blood has to pump. If you have healthy arteries, if your arteries are not stiff, if you don't have high blood pressure, you don't have as much afterload. So your heart won't have to pump as hard. So you don't develop hypertrophy. So something that happens when you receive blood in your chambers of your heart, whether the atrial or the ventricles, of course, as you receive blood, your cavities, your chambers expand. And you reach a point that you have enough blood that your muscles are so stretched that will lead to the maximum contraction. This is the Frank-Starling law. Not because you add more volume into the chambers and you have a huge dilation of your chamber, that means that your heart will contract the most. There is a limit. So it's like if someone has a problem in the heart, it's an aged person, the heart doesn't pump as hard because of aging muscle, you will start giving an IV line to increase the volume in the person so that the heart will contract strongly because you dilate more. No. The heart also has its limit. Like you cannot, if you have 120 milliliters at the end of diastole and you want to double it like 240, don't think like the heart is dumb. Oh yeah, I have a bunch of blood, I'm going to pump all. No. It will give up. It will be like, no, this is too much for me. If you want, I can still give you 70 out of the 240 that you gave me, and I will pump less. I will pump at my rate, not at my capacity, not at what you are giving me. Okay? And then your heart pumping ability is known as contractility. Of course, the younger that you are, the stronger that your muscle of the heart will be, the strongly that you will contract. And then something that affects the contractility is called inotropic agents. So sometimes we have like calcium channel blockers that can decrease that contractility to help to treat an arrhythmia, for instance, or plainly to decrease blood pressure. And then that's an inotropic agent, affects contractility. We have chronotropic agents, in which basically you have agents that increases the number of times that your heart will beat. If you have low blood pressure and you don't pump as much blood, you want to increase the time. So in this case, you have a chronotropic agent that can increase, like, for instance, epinephrine derivatives. So afterload, again, it is the pressure or the force against what the heart is supposed to contract to push the blood. And if someone has high blood pressure, whether in the systemic circuit or pulmonary circuit, you want to decrease that so that your left or right ventricle doesn't increase in size. So here is what we have as an example of an afterload. So your aorta, maybe you will have calcification, accumulation of plaque. In that case, the pressure increases because there is a narrow space for the blood to be ejected. So in this case, your heart has to pump harder. That becomes hypertrophic, the left side. So here we have a scenario. So we have a high preload, meaning that you have more volume coming into your, into your atria or into your ventricles. And then you have increased contractility, and then you have a decreased afterload. So an increase of preload, because you're receiving more volume, will increase your EDV, your end diastolic volume. It can go a little bit higher than 120 milliliters. That will increase the stroke volume up to a limit. And that will increase the delivery of blood into your tissues. Now, if you increase your contractility, that can decrease the end systolic volume. And that can increase your stroke volume. If you decrease your afterload, that can also decrease your end systolic volume, and that will increase your stroke volume. How can you decrease your stroke volume? By having decreased preload, like when someone is having a hemorrhage, when your heart is beating less forcibly, when your afterload increases. All of that decreases your stroke volume. So you can kind of say, well, if you have increased afterload, if you have increased resistance, that means that someone who has hypertension is delivering much blood into the tissues. No, it's the opposite. You have less stroke volume. So that results in ventricular hypertrophy. If it's left, it is because your systemic circuit, it is more narrow, the arteries are providing a lot of resistance. And if it's in the right, it's because your pulmonary trunk or pulmonary arteries or something in the heart, in the lungs, it is preventing the blood from being delivered. So like something greater than 28 millimeters of mercury, which is the normal pressure on the pulmonary circuit. So you can have positive or negative chronotropic agents, something that can increase the heart rate, sympathetic nervous system, certain hormones, certain drugs like amphetamine, increased body temperature, increases your heartbeat. You can have the opposite effect, like lower temperature, parasympathetic nervous system. When someone has basically intake of drugs that decrease the blood pressure, that's a negative, like propranolol, decreases the heart rate. And then innervation of the heart is given by sympathetic nervous system, which increases the heart rate, and then parasympathetic nervous system that decreases the heart rate, specifically through the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. So the sympathetic nervous system can make your SA node to fire up to 180 or 200 beats per minute, because it will allow more calcium ion to enter to the cardiac muscle cells. So not only increases the heart rate, but also can increase the contractility of your heart. So your heart beats faster and stronger with the sympathetic nervous system. And with parasympathetic system, which releases acetylcholine, that activates receptors in your SA node that decreases the generation of action potentials. So your heartbeat decreases in rate. So here's basically the diagram. So the cardiovascular center, we have it in the medulla oblongata. So we have nerves, like the sympathetic nerves, that basically has a positive effect in your heart rate and also in your contractility. And then the parasympathetic nervous system that decreases your heart rate. Not the contractility of the heart, but the heart rate. Examples of hormones that affect the heart rate: thyroid hormone increases it, same as glucagon. Aldosterone, an antidiuretic hormone, increases the blood volume, which increases the preload and increases the cardiac output. These are the hormones that are released when someone is dehydrated or is losing volume because he has a hemorrhage. And then atrial natriuretic peptide, if someone receives an extra number of milliliters in fluid because you don't calculate right the amount of fluid that you're supposed to give to the person. In this case, your right atria expands because you receive more blood volume, and then you release atrial natriuretic peptide that makes the person to urinate more, to lose volume. That reduces the cardiac output. Body temperature, again, affects. So if someone is in cold temperature, the heart rate decreases. If it's in higher temperature, the heart rate increases. And that's the flow of everything. What can decrease the cardiac output and what can increase it? We already went into all of this. For heart failure, basically the heart can be affected, whether the right or the left side. So when you have left ventricular failure, you have your lungs accumulating fluid. This is pulmonary edema. And when you have the right side of the heart failing, your legs and your feet will accumulate fluid. This is peripheral edema. Treatment is to increase the contractility of the heart in some cases, lifestyle modification, including decreasing weight, exercise if the person can do it, decrease sodium intake, and fluid restrictions. And you can give drugs to make the heart to be stronger. So that's all for this chapter.